So just to get started, I want to say, as social scientists committed to understanding the complexities of human societies, it's important to begin by acknowledging the land that which we gather. The University of Toronto operates on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit. The land has been a site of human activity, governance, knowledge exchange, and cultural expression for thousands of years. It remains home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize the enduring presence and resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. As we engage in scholarly inquiry, let us reflect on the responsibilities we carry as researchers, educators, and community members to respect Indigenous knowledge systems, histories, and rights.
Welcome everyone to the Reframing Pain Conference. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to have this day finally arrive. At this particular historical moment, I think it's more important than ever for us to gather together in the work that we do toward equity, toward social justice, and be able to support each other. So PEPPR is the project from which CASPR emanates. So PEPPR has two main objectives. The first is to bring an equity lens into this notion of patient engagement and research, and to really explore both what that does look like and what it could look like. And then the second objective, which relates directly to CASPR, is that we have a mission to advance critical social science approaches in the chronic pain and pain research spaces. We are inter and multidisciplinary. We have anthropology, we have sociology, we have nursing, philosophy, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, psychology, social work. You name it. The disciplines, I think, are represented through CASPR. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to all the speakers who've traveled so far to join us today.
I think what's the central project of all my work on pain, which is like, what happens if we really just take pain patients seriously? And that's the question that sits at the heart of this presentation. So I spent the last 2 decades of my life, really, studying how people in pain navigate really mostly headache disorders when medicine either can't or very often won't, because they can't access the care. Because, by the way, I'm American and I'm so sorry about that. And I'm sorry about everything. When they can't access care and they can't get the care they need. Okay, so my first book is about migraine. My second is about cluster headache. And in the talk, I wanted to introduce both of my projects, both of those books, and then show these 4 lessons. And I wanted to start with how it started. So my headaches began when I was 5, and the pediatrician told my parents there was nothing that could be done because I have a type A personality, and you already know that that is wrong. And my mother also knew, even when I was 5, that was incorrect. She had migraines herself and knew how easy it was for doctors to dismiss pain. And it's funny, I'm a parent now, and there are things that you'll accept for your own life, but you will not for your children. And she was not going to have that for me. So my childhood, all the way till I got to leave home, was a lot of memories of doctor's office and a lot of strange healers, right? Everything, allergists, herbalists, kind of weird traction things. And some of those people were really nice to me. A lot of them were not very nice to me. Some of those things maybe helped a little. Most of those things did not. But what I really learned was that most people didn't really know what was happening, and that migraine, the migraine attacks that I had, and nobody ever diagnosed me properly. It was my problem. That was going to be my problem. So I also learned that I was going to have to pretend to be fine. And a lot of kids with migraine can't get to school. They're really severely disabled. I was pretty lucky. I could stay in school. I could do, I could get through things, even though I was pretty sick. But I always felt like this, like everybody saw me as fragile and weak, and that scared me. So that was the lesson that I came. But I also accepted that, like migraine's super boring. Like it's very common, it's just a headache, and why would anybody care? Why should anybody care? So I'm gonna fast forward to graduate school. A professor, I went into graduate school definitely not going to study migraine. But I remember, you're fishing around for projects, and I remember a professor, I don't remember the professor's name, but I remember a professor saying something that really stopped me in my tracks, which was that sociologists knew a lot about problems that were big problems that people cared about, but if we really wanted to understand social problems, we had to understand why there were these big issues that bothered a lot of people and that they never got any attention. Those troubling issues, as Mills would say, never consolidated into problems. Basically the study of ignorance, which became an enduring fascination of mine. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. How do you study ignorance? Like, where's the data? How do you do that empirically? And I was like, well, maybe I'm it, right? Like, nobody knows anything about this thing that bothers me and bothers my mother and bothers, migraine's genetic. I come from this family that's always in pain, and nobody knows anything about it, and nobody cares. And I was like, oh, this is a great case study. Of course, because my central question was, why doesn't anybody care about migraine? None of the faculty in my department, except for my blessed dissertation chair, thought it was a good idea for me to do. They were like, why would you do that? That's so boring. Anyway, migraine is a really big deal. It affects globally between 12 to 15% of the American adults, if you want to pay attention to dailies in the WHO, and you might not want to. It is the second cause of years lived with disability in the world, and the number one cause of disability for women of childbearing age worldwide. In the United States, more than 40 million adults in the US have migraine. And this is just a shockingly big number to me when I think about that being more than, there are more people with migraine in the US than live in California. So I think about right now, I think about the Electoral College a lot. Migraine could be a really powerful state. And like California, it's just a lot less fun to visit. Okay. I'm allowed to tell migraine jokes, right? That's what I get for having to have it all the time. Okay, so this is my first book, Not Tonight. And the question I really wanted to ask here was, why is a problem that's so prevalent, disabling, economically costly, that so many people have, get almost no federal fund, well, nothing gets federal funding in the US anymore, but then almost no federal funding. Why are doctors know so little about it? Why is it so hard to get a diagnosis? Why don't people, all of these things. Maybe it's obvious that it's because so many women have it. At the time, the early aughts, I was like, I don't know, breast cancer's doing it. It sounds so naive to me now. But anyway, I wanted to know what was going on. And so it was a multi-sited ethnography with, a big history component. And essentially, and also I will say, when I did a lot of the research for this book, there was a relatively new drug on the market, sumatriptan. The triptans were on patent. Doctors would say in my field work, oh, this drug is so great. We don't even, this is going to run us out of business. It's like this magic cure. But when I looked at the discourse, what was very consistent over time was whatever the explanatory model was for migraine, physicians really imputed a moral character, and it really gendered moral character onto the person they were treating. So just 3 examples. In the late 19th century, Latham talked about people with migraine possessing a nervous temperament. Their brains were very excitable, their senses acute, their imagination's free. So the nervous temperament, that to me is a very physiological explanation. Go to the mid-20th century, psychosomatic medicine is ascendant. Walter Alvarez, this guy, I love this guy because he gave me the best quotes. He writes, "It's an axiom with me that whenever a woman is having 3 attacks of migraine a week, it means she's either psychopathic or else she's overworking or worrying or fretting or otherwise using her brain wrongly." Right? Another, again, nervous, excitable, psychopathic fretting. To me, this is the same language. And then I move forward to the neurobiological paradigm. This is from a trade book, but I would see this in the scientific literature as well. Carolyn Bernstein's self-help book, "Your brain is as high maintenance as they come, like a thoroughbred racehorse or diva. It's hypersensitive, demanding, overly excitable. It insists everything in an environment remains stable." So essentially, telling people that they have a brain disease isn't very helpful. First of all, nobody wants a broken brain, and maybe it relieved people with migraine of responsibility, but if your brain is really sensitive to anything, right? If your brain needs to be like really calm because it's really neurotic, like nobody's gonna wanna hire you, right? Nobody's gonna wanna be it doesn't really reduce stigma. So that's the argument of my first book. Now, how do I go from that to my second book, which is called Psychedelic Outlaws? My second book is about people with cluster headache. Now, by the time, I start this book right at the tail end of writing Not Tonight, and I did not want to write a second book about headache, to be fair. I really didn't. And, but this story, I have to say, this story I just love. Sometimes you stumble into a story that you have to write. And it's not that often that you stumble into a story about people who are super, super brave, brave people people in pain who are brave. I don't know that many stories that present people in pain as very brave. And that is epic in scope. So this is what happened. I'm in Washington, D.C. in 2012. I'm attending a relatively new annual event called Headache on the Hill. It brings people who care about headache. I mean, there are like very few people there, right? People who care about headache to lobby their Congress people. It was, the times I had been there, a pretty boring affair, like mostly neurologists wearing kind of business casual. They would shake each other's hand and then just go on their screens. And in walks this group of people, and they're like having the best time. They're hugging, it's like they're in a competition over like who can make the other person laugh more. And I'm like, this meeting just got a lot more fun. And I'm an ethnographer, so I'm curious. And then the doctor next to me gives me a little jab in the side and whispers, "They're the patients who use magic mushrooms to treat their cluster headache." And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So I was definitely, like, if you're an ethnographer, like, I was like, I'm gonna go hang out with those people. Like, those are the fun people, right? And I had a lot of questions. Now, at that point, I had written about cluster headache, but I had not spent a lot of time with people with cluster headache. It's a much rarer disease. And so I hope you don't mind if I give you a little bit of information about what cluster headache is like. So cluster headache is often described as one of the most excruciating forms of pain known to affect humans. And I don't love comparing pain. I really don't. But there was a survey conducted by people with almost a lot of the research on cluster headache is being conducted by this group of people because otherwise there would be no research. So they surveyed over 1,300 people with cluster headache and asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 10 cluster headache attacks and other painful events, phenomenon they experienced. And this is just a selection of what they found. They actually had like 30-some people who had had stab wounds and a couple dozen people who had also been shot by a gun. And you can see cluster headache attacks, they ranked at 9.7, and unmedicated labor at 7.2. I mean, so they think cluster headache, at least they think cluster headache is very, very painful. Cluster headache lasts about 15 minutes to 3 hours, but the attacks recur multiple times per day, as opposed to migraine, which is 4 to 72 hours. The attacks are relentless. They often strike in the middle of the night. And like any pain condition, like this incommensurability issue, it's really hard to understand the intensity. But that trip to DC The next day when we were on the hill, I was paired with somebody with cluster headache. And he had chronic cluster headache since he was a child. That's a terrible way to live your life. He hadn't, because his REM sleep is a trigger for the attacks, he told me he had not had more than 90 minutes of uninterrupted sleep in years. And what I saw in him, and I've seen this look many times since, is a kind of terror in his eyes that I'd never seen before. And when you see how many of you have met somebody with cluster headache in a cycle? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Like when they're really afraid? It's like nothing I've seen before. It's really shocked me. Medical care is difficult to find. It takes right now about 5 years on average to get a diagnosis. The diagnosis can help people find online support, and that's when they discover a group that will explain to them how to use mushrooms, which active ingredient is psilocybin, to interrupt the cycles of attacks. So the cycles last anywhere between a week to several months, and they occur in like clusters of those times, right? So people go into remission. Anyway, I wanted to know more. Bob Wold, their founder, was obliging enough to invite me to their event, and let me see, I think I have some pictures. This is like what they always meet in like airport hotels that are really inexpensive. And I didn't know what this psychedelic meeting would look like, and I thought it would be like really groovy, but it wasn't. It was just basically like a self-help meeting. Lots of oxygen tanks, which they use as an abortive. And this is like the one piece of like, they have like some tie-dye shirts available. And I saw a lot of people meeting another person with cluster headache for the first time, because it's a pretty unusual disease, and people feel pretty isolated when they have it because they're really scared to tell anybody else what they have, because it makes them suicidal. Ideation is very high during cycles. Okay, so I was really taken by these conferences and what I saw. So that experience became the foundation of this book. It followed those people with cluster headache. I wanted to know how they figured out this protocol, which really did seem to be working, and the biochemistry makes sense. They have taken it to Harvard, to Yale. They have randomized control trials, very small ones, with some support. Headache specialists, pretty sure it works, and I'm not going to get very deep into that, but I would welcome questions about all of that. So I wanted to know how they developed this medicine, and I went back into the history of LSD and ergot, all the way back into peyote and so forth in the book, right? Okay, so the books they're somewhat different, right? Not Tonight shows what happens when pain is rendered invisible. It's trivialized in science, stigmatized in culture, and dismissed in the clinic. Psychedelic Outlaws follows what happens when pain is kind of a force for innovation, when people are so desperate they need to do something, when they start resisting suppression of science and they build something entirely new. And I really kind of needed that at that time. I was so tired of scientists telling me they couldn't do things because there were no grants. And to see patients in that conference room doing it anyway, making the knowledge anyway, and doing it with a Schedule I drug was really empowering, and I really wanted to understand it. Okay. All right, so on to my lessons. So the first one. I really think of pain patients, and maybe this is from my original insight I had in graduate school. They're theorists of ignorance, right? They're theorists of medical failure. And because I study ignorance and I'm drawn to these gaps in medicine, these are moments when real suffering is met with nothing is wrong with you. I mean, patients can tell you what is missing in medicine. And I mean, we're all familiar with that, as talking to patients as a method. But this, I think, is as a method for kind of identifying gaps and ignorance is really useful. And I want to point out, yes, like you have to be really careful when you don't want to totalize experience. It is white patients who are public and meeting in hotels to talk about psychedelics. They are the ones who feel comfortable enough to do that and safe enough to do that. So you're really getting like very limited kinds of experience. But I really started to think through what patients could offer in terms of doing this kind of work of locating absence. But I also want to say that the flip side of that is what I think is like an ethical praxis of representing patient experience, not just as data, but as like a form of care in my writing. I receive messages, after both books, I receive messages for, at least from, and for Not Tonight, I still receive messages of thanks that are so moving. And maybe you all get this too, I hope you do. But it's really important to me that I do my best to represent back people in pain's experience in as deep and detailed a way as possible. So I'll just give you one quote. Maybe this is like too self-congratulatory, but just something somebody sent to me recently that I really loved. I read things I felt and thought and had never heard articulated before. The fear of the law, the fear of losing your mind from a dose, the desperation. The first time Bob being he teaches a lot of people how to use psilocybin. The first time Bob tried psilocybin and the pain drained from his face, I'm chronic and I felt the same. I left the house, I felt free. The isolation, the sway between hope and dread, the danger of leaning too far in either direction, that one really got me. And I think like it's so isolating to be in pain, and so if there's one thing I can do to give back is to kind of help people process their own experience. That I find I've learned over time that really seems to help people, and I think it's really important if we're going to use their knowledge to try and give back in any way I can. Okay, second, this is like standard sociology of technology stuff. There's no magic pill. And I really, I love Bob Wold, the founder of Clusterbusters. He said this, and I just was like, yes, you're right. You can't bring a transformational medicine into a broken system. Headache medicine has seen a couple different waves of excitement about breakthrough treatments in my time studying them. But most people with headache disorders never get to the clinic. They never seek help, and when they do, they don't get diagnosed. And when they get diagnosed, they don't get the right treatment. That's not about medicine. Doesn't matter how good your medicine if it never gets to the people who need it. The system is broken. And now studying psychedelics, it's so hyped. People talk about psychedelics like the same way they talked about Prozac, the same way they talk about any other miracle cure. And studying, how many of you have been following the psychedelics and pain? A few of you? It's really marginalized in the broader psychedelic arena. They've struggled to even get spaces on this is like not surprising if you study pain. It's been really, really disheartening to watch. These guys were doing their research at Harvard in 2004. They're like the OGs of the psychedelic renaissance, and they cannot get on a panel in some of these big conferences, right? But his insight doesn't come from working with mushrooms. It comes from actually his work with high-flow oxygen. Doctors have been using high-flow oxygen to abort cluster headaches since the 1950s. It is one of the safest, fastest, most effective, most affordable treatments for cluster headache as an abortive. It's really hard for patients to get. The barriers are everywhere. It's not FDA approved. It makes reimbursements harder. Doctors don't prescribe it. They think it's dangerous. When they do prescribe it, they prescribe it incorrectly with like a cannula, not with a non-rebreather mask. So patients don't know how to use it. So they get it prescribed and they're like, oh, it didn't work for me. It's very, very hard for patients to get it. So patients, what I discovered, because this group is so tightly networked, they teach each other hacks to use the oxygen. Maybe sometimes it's about how to get a prescription, how to go to the firehouse, right? They have oxygen. Don't go to the ER. Go, see if there's an ambulance, they have oxygen in their, there. How to use industrial welding oxygen. It's the same as medical oxygen, but make sure your tank is clean. So they know that the best thing that they know, it says like the mushrooms are not the best drug, but they're the drug they can grow in their home. They are patching the broken system, and he knows that. Okay, taking too long, so I will get through in my next lesson. The profound unmet need fuels outlaw innovation. And what I want to say about this, so they are not just dealing, they have all these hacks for oxygen, and they have lots and lots of other things that they've developed, and they are really, it's really like when I go to these conferences, actually the last Cluster Buster conference I went to, they turned into a CME and they brought in a bunch of headache specialists. And the headache specialists were like blown away because this is where the best knowledge is being shared. But what I just wanted to say about this is that people in pain, you don't need like this big story about bringing a psychedelic to Yale and getting into a randomized controlled trial. I mean, that's a great story, but people in pain have a million hacks. People with chronic illness and disability, they have a million hacks to manage their life. And it's not really presented to them as though they're being innovative or they're developing something new, but they are. And I think it would be really important and powerful. I mean, Laura Maudlin does some of this work in disability studies, showing people how they are developing knowledge, that kind of know-now that Poles talks about, I think is really useful. Okay, and the last thing I want to say is how much community mattered and how much I learned from the community from this group. So I want to just introduce you to Rhonda. And I'm going to tell you about Rhonda. Rhonda had cluster headaches when she was 13. She's in her 50s now. It took about 10 years for her to get a diagnosis. They kept telling her it was her hair, like making her head hurt. I don't know. Sumatriptan made her sick, so she didn't use it. I don't know how she managed to raise her kids on her own. In 2015, she was beginning to feel really desperate, and then she saw, let's see if I can get this to play, this little tiny clip of this documentary.
Voice is very simple for me. Suicide or psychedelics.
Dan suffers from one of the most painful afflictions known to humankind, cluster headaches.
Right here you can see a little bit about what it
The
is.
headaches afflict around 1 in 1,000 people, and men are more prone than women.
These can't be compared with a headache or a head attack.
So she saw that, and she was like, wait, you can use mushrooms and oxygen? Like, in all of that time, she didn't know about either. So she goes online, and she finds a Facebook group for cluster headache, and she asks, have you guys heard of either, like, using mushrooms or oxygen for cluster headache? And she gets a DM, and it's from that guy, Dan Irvin. And he's like, yeah, the mushrooms work, and so does oxygen. And so you need to get to Chicago in September for the Cluster Busters conference. And she's like, oh, I don't know, it costs a lot of money. And he's like, it's okay, if you can get there, I'll pay for your hotel room. And she's like, you are a creep. And he's like, listen, my wife's gonna call you, it's fine. And he does do this, he pays for people to stay. He feels really passionate about it. And she's like, this is gonna be so boring. Like, what? I don't wanna hang out with people in pain. So she's like, I've never been to Chicago. She comes with an itinerary, ready to like skip the whole thing. Oh, let's see. She goes to mushroom demonstrations, she learns about oxygen, and she meets people she connects with. She says about it, I didn't expect to connect with these people and cry like a baby when I had to leave. She decides oxygen's gonna be the treatment for her. She's Canadian, actually. She goes back to Canada. She can't find anybody to prescribe her oxygen. But she had met enough people from this meeting that she found oxygen through someone else. And that's really how it works. People are helping each other get the treatments they need. But I wanted to say something else happened at that meeting. She met this guy, Dan, and I just want to say, that's the other Dan behind her, and like, he does look a bit like a creeper there. But this Dan was different. He was cute, and as it turns out, he was single. He had grown kids. He also had cluster headaches, and his were much worse than Rhonda. Rhonda had a cycle once a year, sometimes twice a year. And his were actually made worse by a surgery. It's a terrible situation. And after the surgery, he was in full-time disability. The implant that they gave him for his cluster headache, the company, of course, that gave him the implant went out of business. The implant worked, but they nicked his nerve. And when the company went out of business, after it went out of business, the battery in the stimulant died. And he was like, what am I going to do? And then, of course, somebody else in the cluster buster community had another one of these simulators. Again, this is how it works. They work together. It's like mutual aid. It was a cluster head in Denmark. Anyway, Rhonda understood what he was going through. He understood her, and without either one of them, they just got together and they took care of each other. They got married last September at the Cluster Buster conference, and that's Bob Old, the founder. He's not looking, he just had cancer. And it was a Woodstock-themed wedding, and they invited everybody at the meeting. And they have family, they have their own family, but they wanted their chosen family there. It was witnessed by the people they considered most important because these are the people who helped them survive. Dan, who had helped her go, he walked her down the aisle. And I just wanted to point out, the best men are in a text group with her husband, and they have a text group, they all have cluster headache, and he says they never ever talk about headache. And that's what makes them so special. And the bridesmaids, they had their party, and they are their best friends. And I really, after all the 10 years of field work, I really felt like I really took away something important from that. They have a full life, but this is the fact that they chose this. Medicine, if you look at psychedelic research, they think the mushrooms are the treatment, and maybe they think psychedelic-assisted therapy is important. It's certainly not important for this treatment. But after a decade of being with this community, I can tell you the healing comes from the hope and the connection and the social integration that this group has built together. They are often suicidal, and they literally keep each other alive. And I want to know more about that social life, building that social community in pain. This is like an embodiment of what Durkheim said. Durkheim said social integration mattered. Anyway, I just wanted to end by saying, what would it mean to treat peer support as something more formal infrastructure in chronic pain care, and to take it seriously? Maybe even new rules for patients, either within clinics or outside of clinics. There's peer, there are people who do kind of peer treatment in mental health. Why not in pain treatment? That's what I saw them doing without money. Why, maybe we could even pay people. Could this be a model? Lived experience, could we treat lived experience not just as data, but as expertise? So I will leave it there. I just wanted to add, I do think we also have to think really very seriously about the people we leave out of this research, and I am very painfully aware of that in this. It was so hard for me to recruit just really honestly anybody who is not white who would talk to me about both pain and psychedelics, either one. And of course that has to do with my own embodiment and my own limitations. So I'll leave it there, but thank you.